Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture on cybersystemics, what it is, and why is it useful for a new way to think about a complex problems. My name is Chet Fong Tan, and I am an associate professor in transformation leadership, UCL's Faculty of Maths and Physical Sciences, and I'll be chairing today's lecture. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Stephen Harwood. Stephen Harwood has recently joined the UCL Center for Systems Engineering in the Department of Space and Climate Physics as a lecturer. His research is multidisciplinary with emphasis upon sustainable development and the strategic application of emerging technologies through the conceptual lens of cybersystemics. This presented a growing portfolio of publications. His industrial experience spans the coal, oil, electronics, and tourism industries with a variety of roles that include geophysicist, writer, educator, change agent, entrepreneur, and director. So before we begin, I wanted to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and this can be submitted at any point during Stephen's talk, going to Slido. So enter into your internet browser and entering the event code #cybersystemics. I will now hand over to Stephen for his talk.
Thank you. Let's look at planet Earth. We look at it, then we see a very peaceful place, don't we? Until we end up on the surface of it and we start to see that there's a lot of issues. Many issues, I've just captured a few: mental health, we see migration of peoples, we've got geopolitics, climate change, and we've got emerging technologies being issues. If we start to think about how we characterize these issues that are problematic, then I suggest the words complexity, uncertainty, and turbulence are the important words here. If we start looking at this, then I suggest that we can actually make sense and handle many of these situations using the concepts of cybersystemics. What I'd like to do in this presentation, in this talk, is just explore what the challenges that we're trying to face, why cybersystemics, and explain a couple of approaches to this, and then explore work in progress, and then finally finish up with a wrap up. Let's look at the challenge. Why cybersystemics? Well, Rio +20, there was a clear and explicit statement for holistic and integrated approaches to sustainable development. If we start thinking about what this is, then we're starting to look at approaches to handling complexity, uncertainty, and turbulence here. And we start thinking about what this complexity is. Imagine, have a look at this picture. This is a picture of London, and with it, if you start making distinctions, then you will see that you can make lots of different distinctions. You can perceive lots of different things. You will start to perceive its complexity here. Complexity is in the eye of the beholder, and we start to think about it in terms of the number of perceived states here. But we start looking at this from different perspectives, then people would perceive different things in this. And this introduces the notion of variety. We've got complexity in the eye of the beholder in terms of the number of perceived states, but we actually think about the number of possible states in there, then we start to get an appreciation of the variety. And this is revealing in terms of this notion of what it is that we're actually focusing in upon here. And if we start thinking about this in terms of systems, we can identify physical entities as systems such as the railway system. We can look at it in terms of buildings, boats, cars, and what have you. But if you think about what's the system that the individual is in, then we think of it in terms of, well, what system does the person belong to? If it's an educational system, or a health system, or what have you. What we're starting to do is mentally construct this social system. And we're starting to create boundaries using the names to create the boundaries of the systems that we're talking about. It introduces the notion that we've got systems within systems within systems. And with it, we've got this unfolding complexity emerging from this. So when we start looking at this unfolding complexity, different systems, different perspectives, and perhaps contradictions with regard to what is viewed as important, then how do we respond to this? I suggest cybersystemics. Cybersystemics is a phrase that was generated by Gary Boyd, but it was Ron Eisen that generated awareness of this in a variety of papers around about 2015-16. What I've got is, what I've done is define cybersystemics is learning about situational complexity and how to manage it. Cybersystemics is the fusion of cybernetics and systems thinking. If we start looking at cybersystemics and the notion of cybernetics and systems thinking, then what we've got is cybernetics as one domain of thinking. Systems thinking actually is a fusion of different approaches to thinking about systems. And then we can throw in complexity theory, which is drawn from thermodynamics with regard to its contribution here. When we start looking at systems, they're all focused upon the source systems methodology domain and its systems thinking approaches here. Systems thinking is captured in the seminal book by Peter Checkland. And when we look at this particular book, he presents systems thinking through the lens of the source systems methodology. And with it, source systems methodology is a way of making sense of knowing, embracing ideas of emergence. The whole is more than the sum of the parts, the notion of hierarchy, systems within systems and systems, and communication and control. Communication and control takes us to the notion of cybernetics, because cybernetics is, well, what is cybernetics? Cybernetics, well, we can confuse that with many different usage of cyber, the prefix cyber, cyber capping, cyber pet, cyberphobia, cyberpunk, cyber war, cyber squat. But what is the cybernetics thing? When we start looking at it, then cybernetics is defined as the science of communication control in man and machine, and captured in this book by Norbert Wiener, written in 1948. We look at cybernetics. Then we have in the 1940s a group of scientists who come together, and with it they recognize that they are talking about the same thing but using different languages here. And we see this congregating into the Macy conferences between 1946 and 1953. And with it we have groups of scientists who are discussing their commonalities to come up with this common language here. If we look at this particular list of attendees, then what we've got are people from psychiatry, physiology, sociology, psychology, ethnography, anatomy and neurology, mathematics, and what have you. We've got true interdisciplinarity here. When we start looking at it, we have the conferences or the ratio club emerging as a group of people, of scientists coming together in the late 1940s. And with it, we have them coming together to discuss their views about scientists in the UK. If you look at this diagram, we've got Alan Turing as a member of this in the bottom left-hand corner, but in the top right-hand corner, we've got Ross Ashby. Ross Ashby is an important figure. He is a psychiatrist and had a great interest in trying to provide a mechanical explanation of how the brain adapted. But he was responsible for writing his book on cybernetics here in 1956. This book on cybernetics presented the principles of cybernetics, explaining such concepts as stability, variety, feedback, and homeostasis. So we start looking at further developments, 1960s, the space age, and we've got the notion of cyborg being presented by Kleins and Klein. This was the view that if man is going to travel in space, then how would he survive in space? And the idea was of incorporating or augmenting the human body with technology, and with it we're looking at how we can have homeostatic relationship between technology and the human body, and with it allow the person to travel safely in space. This is an important development, because what we have with regard to the Bible systems model and Stafford Beer's work is a shift to looking at social cybernetics here. We're looking at the cybernetics of human organization, and with this translated into a very important model called the Bible systems model, which I'll be talking about later. But what's significant about this particular model was that it was demonstrated and it underpinned the development of Project Cybersyn, which was a project to try and more effectively organize the nationalized industry of Chile in between 1971 and 1973. It was innovative in terms of its concepts and had the idea of an operations room being fed real-time information. And at that time, it was by telex. And the narrative of this is written up in the work of Eden Medina here. What I want to draw upon is the work of Maturana and Heinrich Förster. This introduces the notion of second-order cybernetics. Anything said is said by an observer. Anything said is said to an observer. We look at this notion. We're moving away from what we observe to the observer and their organization here. We're looking at it in terms of how we can actually make better sense of us as observers and what the ramifications of that. This is the notion of second-order cybernetics. We start looking at the images here. We've got Heinrich Förster in the right and in the left-hand side, Humberto Maturana in the center. But I'm also introducing Raul Espejo, who's in the right-hand side, because it is his work that I want to draw upon, because he has been a very influential leader and thought leader on this one. So let's move on to explanations, applications. If we want to look at this, then we've got two models or two approaches. We've got the Bible systems model, which is a model of complexity, of organizational complexity. And we've got the VIPLAN methodology, which is an approach for how we handle organizational complexity here. And I want to just quickly explore this because they are very important and complement each other. If we start looking at the Bible systems model, the Bible systems model is represented by this diagram. This diagram appears very complex, but let's just try and pack it and see what this implies. If we start thinking about a group of people working together, then we can look at them engaged in purposeful activity, primary activity. And we start thinking about this primary activity of an organization in terms of what it does, but we have to regulate this activity because we want to reduce the likelihood of unacceptable outcomes. I want to produce bricks, but I don't want to produce defective bricks. So we start thinking about the nature of this regulatory mechanism, and we can pack it and reveal 5 mechanisms. These 5 mechanisms are coordination, control, intelligence, policy, and monitoring. If we start looking at this, then we can think about the coordination. We look at these people engaged in the primary activity, and we look at how they synchronize their activity. And with that, we'd be able to get the coordination of these activities here. Control, we're looking at, are they achieving the targets are set? We're looking at control perhaps as edict, but that's only one way of thinking about control. Control can be considered in an alternative way. We can think of it in terms of this group of people receiving benefits in terms of wage in response for performing here. So we've got 2 ways to actually think about this notion of control. By edict, which maybe is the way that many people think about it, but we can think about it in terms of this exchange, that in return for you will be given here. We start thinking about monitoring. We look at sporadic monitoring to ensure that what's happening is what should be happening here. Then we think about it in terms of what's going on outside and the changes, and this is the intelligence function. And through the intelligence function interacting with control, and we have an adaptation mechanism. And then we start thinking about the direction. The direction is set by policy. So we have a very simple way of actually unpacking this notion of what constitutes regulation, which in terms of engagement with outside, then we start looking at how it handles the everyday, but we also think about it in terms of how we handle the disturbances. We absorb the disturbances. We're looking at resilience here. I'm going to just turn this model on its side because what I want to do is I want to reduce it down. And what we can see are perhaps 4 individuals operating as 2 groups within a named entity. Named entity here. And with it, what we've got is the organization, what's going on inside the organization with what's going on outside the organization. If we start looking at this, we can start thinking of it in terms of an autocratic interpretation of the VSM through the edict, control, the association of control and edict and lines of authorities, which we tend to associate with centralized organizations here. Another way of thinking about this is to think about it as each particular level having a degree of autonomy here. We're looking at the self-regulation and the autonomy within the particular level. And with it, we've got self-regulation, self-organization, the notion of autonomy. And I want to just let you think about this notion of autonomy because it's important when I talk about the example that will come up later here. When we start looking at this, you can perhaps understand now what the nature of this model is. We can see that we've got different levels of recursion of the systems in this. So you can perhaps understand now the Bible system model in a very simplistic manner here. In terms of actually how we can use the model, then I suggest that we can look to what is called the VIPLAN methodology. I don't have time to go into this, but the VIPLAN methodology is a way to actually use the model. However, when we start thinking about this in terms of organization of people, then what I would suggest is we can redefine this notion of what cybernetics actually is. Cybernetics is a science of communication and control, control of man and machine. It's a bit of a nebulous concept, that, but if we think about it in terms of the science of effective organization, perhaps we can have a better appreciation of what the cybernetics thing is here. In terms of applications of it, then one early paper was looking at the structural dynamics of the tourism industry, a very fragmented industry with many different players in it. Then having looked at it in terms of what the ramifications are with regard to strategy in an organization, how can it enhance our understanding of how strategy is developed in an organization. Then we think about it in terms of a model. We're looking at a model, and a model is a representation of reality. On the other hand, we can use this model perhaps as a device to facilitate conversations about possibilities here. So there's a slightly different way to think about this notion of a model. Then we start thinking about the VIPLAN methodology. I want to talk about this because we start thinking about handling complexity. Complexity is in the eye of the beholder. We've got a messy situation here. We've got the situation characterised by turbulence, uncertainty, complexity. But we start thinking about this. How do we get to some action? How do we make sense of the situation? How do we handle the situation? And I present this ice cream cone model, where what we do is we make sense of the situation, generating some kind of rich picture, structuring the problems, structuring the situation in such a way we can identify the problem. Then we start modeling the situation in terms of perhaps possibilities for action, and then we make the change happen. You will notice that we're starting to become more focused. The boundaries of what we're actually engaging in are starting to solidify, and with it, we're starting to go through a learning process that is iterative. But if we start thinking about this iterative learning process, we need to think about the organizational context. We need to think about the observing system. We're all observers. We need to think about us, the observing system, and what constitutes this observing system. And this leads us to the VIPLAN methodology, which comprises 6 activities. We start looking at this, we understand the situation, we problem structure, we model analyze, we make change happening. Much of this activity is learning. Learning in terms of thinking, learning in terms of action. But I suggest that what we need to do is we actually have to think about the observing system in terms of who's present and who's involved in the discussions, and with how these people are actually organized, which focuses attention upon studying the cybernetics relevant to the activity in the learning domain. For each activity 1, 2, 5, and 6, you will consider what the organizational implications are, the cybernetics implications are, and with you start thinking about what you need to do to create conditions conducive for whatever activity you're actually engaged in here. In terms of finding out, creating a picture, then we have this particular cartoon here. It captures a lot of different dimensions. And this draws attention to a particular study I did many years ago, looking at the universal credit system. As a concept, we're reducing 6 benefits into 1 benefit, which sounds simple. But if we start looking at the organizational issues, the social issues, the political issues, and the rest of it, it reveals a lot of things. We can start to see it in terms of the different levels. We're looking at it in terms of the UK, we're looking in terms of the constituency, the MP's constituency, town centre. We're looking at it in terms of the home, the community. So we're looking at it in terms of different issues, such as the department responsible for universal credit, parliamentary debates, the job centre, the school, the household, employer, and so on. We're starting to capture the complexity of the situation here. And with it, when we come to the problem structuring, we use the richness of this picture to be able to make sense of what's going on, unpack the complexity of it to identify the different levels, and then decide, okay, what's our problem, from what perspective is it that we're actually looking at? Then we come to the activities that you engage in any form of activity, inquiring activity, which is looking at the modelling analysis, and then we're making the change actually happen. And we have the cybernetics with regard to trying to understand who should be involved, how they're organised, and making organizational conditions conducive with whatever it is. When I talk about the word organization, I'm not talking about organization in the noun sense, that an organization with a bounded entity. I'm talking about organization in the verb sense, to organize people here. And in terms of papers relating to this, the Management of Change was a manufacturing organization in search of a weapon exit approach, was looking at the complexity of water, energy, food in the context of the Mekong River Basin. It provides a conceptual argument with regard to how you can actually use this methodology. And then we start looking at the VIPLAN methodology, and this outlines how you can actually make sense of the VIPLAN methodology, revealing how you can actually use it, operationalize it. And then this is the application on a research methods course, where we recognize that one of the biggest challenges that students actually have is coming to the research question, and with it, it helps them to actually make sense of situations to arrive at that question. Let's look at work in progress, because when I start thinking about developments, then I talk about social enterprises. I'm talking to social enterprises, and with it, I've got various projects going up in the Northeast in terms of workshops to try and help social enterprises understand the context in which they operate and the challenges that they face. There's a 2-day hackathon that I've developed, which is looking at sustainable development, and the aim in that is to try and use the VIPLAN methodology to guide the process of sustainable development. But if we start thinking about emerging technologies, I think what we've got with regard to cybersystemics is the possibility to develop an explanatory conceptual framework which helps us to actually better understand emerging technologies. And the emerging technology that I want to focus in upon is this notion of autonomous technological system, autonomous vehicles. We start looking at autonomous vehicles as a technological system, then there are two important words: the autonomy of the technological system and the system itself. And if we're going to try and make sense of autonomous weapons, autonomous technological systems, then I suggest let's look at one particular form, autonomous weapons systems, because I think it draws attention to something that is really important here. And this is the notion of values. When we start thinking about autonomous technological systems, I develop what I suggest is the 3 systems of technology, systems, autonomy, and values. And I'll explain why I've got the third pillar as values when we unpack this. In terms of systems, then we can start to unpack the notion of what constitutes the system. We have the autonomous weapon and deployment of use. But if we start thinking about what this constitutes this the system within which the autonomous weapon is embedded in, then we can perhaps unpack the recursive nature of the many systems within the systems here, and start to think about, well, from the technological perspective, what constitutes the system here? There are multiple levels. If we start thinking about this in terms of autonomy, then we can start thinking about the capability or the capacity for each system for self-regulation. What's the nature of the self-regulation, and where I teach you the different levels that we can actually recognize here. So we start looking at this in terms of a self-regulating system. Then we've got the weapon unit acting, and we know we have to think about the criteria of acceptance. And with it, we start to think about the acceptability of the outcome, and we want to minimize the unacceptable outcomes that actually arise. When we start thinking about this, we've got control determining when and how to act. We start thinking about coordination, because we're not talking about an entity, a single entity, we're talking about the integration with everything else. And we start thinking about how that all is coordinated and integrated with everything else. Then we start thinking about the monitoring, and with it, we're randomly monitoring that all is as it should be. We start thinking about in the intelligence of making sense of what's going on outside, and with it, we start looking at the adaptation mechanism. And with it, we're adapting with regard to how we're acting, and maybe we're actually changing the criteria of acceptance. Then we start thinking about the governing principles of functioning, which is the policy, and with it, the rules of engagement here. We start thinking about this from a threats perspective. We've got cybersecurity issues. However, I want to just let you think about this in terms of governing principles of functioning. What happens if we've got a technological system that is quite integrated, that is able to modify policy? And it does raise the question of human insight here. which draws me to this issue of values, because we are moving from a purely technological issue to one which is focusing upon the human aspect of it and the values. If we look at it in terms of war, then chivalry is can be viewed as a code of ethical behaviour, where we have fairness and mutual respect, where dishonour and treacherous behaviour is looked down upon. But does everyone behave on this basis? To compensate, I suggest we've got international humanitarian law, and from this perspective, we have two basic principles here: one of distinction, the other one of proportionality. Distinction is where we are very clear as to what we're targeting. We are not targeting non-military objects, people. And we've got proportionality in the case we do accidentally hit non-military targets. But there is expectation that we don't have excessive harm here, and that we are getting anticipated military advantage in this one. But we've got a problem, because we're looking at law, we've got the issue of compliance, but there's a question of interpretation here. And if we start thinking about moving into the interpretation side of things, then we start talking about values, what is deemed important. We've got decisions and judgments about what is acceptable, and we start thinking of the consequences and the judgments about what is acceptable here. And if we start looking at theories of ethics, then we start looking at such issues as integrity, identity, responsibilities, commitment. And commitment and trust go hand in hand, because commitment and trust are reciprocal words. We've got respect, care, then we've got justice as well. We've got a lot of different very important issues that relate to this notion of values. But I suggest there's something missing from this. And this is the issue of accountability. When we start thinking about accountability and we start looking at the deployment of autonomous weapons, it does raise the important issue of where is accountability in this. And we start thinking about this, then we can start thinking about this with regard to the 3 pillars and its application to self-driving vehicles and the relevance of this, because we can start thinking about the systems and we can start thinking about the degree of autonomy. What's the autonomous nature of an autonomous vehicle? What constitutes the autonomous system? And then we start thinking about the core principles through our values perspective. Is distinction appropriate here? Is proportionality appropriate here? But what would be the core principles when we start thinking about self-driving vehicles, the autonomous vehicles, well-being, diversity, equality, inclusion, data protection, privacy, trust commitment, cyber security are all issues that we need to think about. But where is the human? Where is the human in all this? Which raises the issue of the future of humans. We start thinking about this, we can go to Steve Hawkins in 2014, and we got this notion of increasing autonomy. We look at these autonomous systems. At what level are we looking at this notion of autonomous from a technological perspective, and where's the role of the human? The development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. Once humans develop artificial intelligence, it would take off on its own and redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate. Humans who are limited by slow biological evolution couldn't compete and would be superseded here. And we just had recently the Bletchley Declaration of the AI Safety Summit and the concerns about this. So when we start looking at cybersystemics, let me just reflect about this. If I start thinking about this, we can look at it in terms of this peaceful world. But when we're on the surface, there's a lot happening. There are a lot of social challenges here. And what I'm suggesting is that what we've got is a need to be able to make sense and deal with the complexity, uncertainty, and turbulence of this. And when we start thinking about this, I suggest that we've got 2 approaches to this. We've got the viable systems model, which is a nice model where we can make sense of the complexity of organization. And we can look at this in terms of how we can make sense of organization, but perhaps design organization. And then we can start thinking about in terms of how we can approach the complexity of complex situations here, which I'll explain what complexity is. How do we make sense of, how do we engage with it? And I suggest we can actually use this, the VIPLAN methodology here. And this leads us on to the 3 pillars, because when we start looking at this, just thinking about the systems and the distributed agency through the notion of recursion, then we've got a third dimension, the third pillar here, which is the values. And we start thinking about the values, then it really draws attention to another dimension, which I think we need to address here. And with that, I want to finish my talk and thank you and ask if there's any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen, for this very interesting talk. And especially on the cybersystemics, especially as well on the VSM and VIPLAN. So I can certainly see how they could be very useful in addressing complex and messy problem situations. So I will move on to Slido to view the questions. Okay, so Stephen, so I mentioned about VIPLAN earlier. So the first question is the VIPLAN methodology is very interesting. Could you please provide practical examples of the VIPLAN methodology's applications?
Okay, one particular application was in a manufacturing organization where I was using the VIPLAN in a very tacit manner. What it allowed me to do was understand the learning side of it, but from an organizational perspective, it allowed me to think about who were the right people to have involved in the discussions in terms of trying to make sense of what was going on with regard to the organizational change. This was a production environment, and it allowed me to make sense of what was going on with regard to who should be involved in the discussions about making sense of what was going on with the production, with regard to who should be involved in the change management, and with regard to how we're going to actually embrace the change itself here. It allowed me to design a system that allowed us to be able to deal with quality defects. We start looking at these quality defects. I think we're running at something like 35% defects. Over a process of about three to 4 months, what we managed to do was create a system at play whereby what we managed to do is reduce these defects to about 3% here through the system, through the process of managing the change that we embraced here. So that was one. Another example was introducing into a research methods course. And what I did in the research methods course was develop people's understanding, not just of how to make sense of situations, but to think about the people that were involved and how they're actually organized here. You start to make sense of the cybernetics of the situation. Does that answer the question?
Yep, thank you for that. And again, I also have another question regarding VIPLAN. So in your view, are there any challenges when using this methodology?
There is a serious challenge with it because there may be the assumption of getting consensus, and that is not the case. In many cases, it's not the case. So the question is, what do you do there? If you've got lots of different views as to what the issues are, does that mean that you have to you come to a stalemate and not do anything? At the end of the day, the question is, what perspectives do you actually look to, and how do you actually address this? So it may well be that you have got politics arising, which prevents you from actually getting this consensus, and you have to somehow manage it like you have with all change management situations.
Right. Just to following up on that as well, Stephen. So you mentioned that this methodology could be useful for addressing like complex or messy problem. So what are the things that you think this methodology has done differently compared to some of the complexity theories that we are using at the moment?
It's a good question, that, and it's an important question, because at the end of the day, when we start looking at it, many approaches actually focus upon the learning loop. We focus upon what's going on with regard to what we're learning, the issues that we're learning about and how to address them. What I'm suggesting is that what we're actually looking at, we should also be looking at are the people who have got involved in the conversations, paying attention to who's excluded from the conversations, and by paying more attention to that, perhaps empowering people with regard to involvement and participation in the changes that we're actually engaging with.
Okay, thank you. Right, for the audience who are viewing online at the moment, so you should be able to see the Slido link. Please do keep your questions coming in. So the next one on Slido that I have here. So in what circumstances would the VSM be used?
I think it can be used in any situation where you've got organizational complexity. There was a very interesting paper many years ago which analysed a swarm of bees and how it was organised. So, but we start looking at this, then we start looking at, well, I've got the tourism and the Scottish tourism industry as an example here. We're looking at the complexity of how the Scottish tourism industry at that stage was not organised, and with how can we actually make sense of what's happening. And we start looking at a particular period in time, and there was actually a bit of significant development there, which involved, remember, it was the demise of the dissolution of the area tourist board and what the consequences would be with whatever it was to replace it. So we start looking at how we can actually make sense of all these different elements that are organised together, and we can use it in a diagnostic mode, but we can also use it in a design mode in terms of trying to develop better, more effective organisations.
So, sorry, just to following up on that as well, when you mentioned about designing organization, so at what level of design you're talking about?
Well, we'll start thinking about it in terms of using the Bible system model as a device to explore the possibilities of what constitutes the recursive nature of an organization. And we start thinking about it, well, what's our system and focus? By focusing in on that, then we can start looking at what the possibilities are. We're looking at using the Bible systems model as a means to orchestrate debates about possibilities and establish where it is that we're actually focusing attention upon. Does that make sense?
Yeah, certainly. Right, I have another question on the VIPLAN as well.
Okay.
Right, so the VIPLAN model looks very similar to the soft system methodology. So how are they compared when used to understand complexity of a problem/system?
Well, the thing about it is, you're right. If you look at the 4 activities of the learning loop, they are the 4 activities of the more recent soft systems methodology presentation. And with the learning issues are very similar. But I would argue that when it comes to the modelling activity, I'm not confining myself to conceptual models. I'm saying that we can mix models of any form, shape, and description here. So it's not just about soft models. We can have hard quantitative models here as well, and how we actually use these together to come up with some kind of solution. So maybe we're using simulation models alongside, perhaps we're looking at modeling the organizational context using the BSM itself and that particular activity. But what makes a distinction, I think, is the focus upon the cybernetics domain. The cybernetics domain is one that I think that differentiates the VIPLAN methodology from all other approaches here. Explicit attention upon the cybernetic, on the people, how they're organized, and how their organization makes a contribution to what we're actually engaging in.
Right, thanks for that. And then you mentioned about modeling organization. So in your view, what sort of variables you will throw into your simulation?
Well, you've got the simulation. I'm not a quantitative simulation expert, so I can't really answer that particular question. But if I'm looking at the variables with regard to the organization, let's try and think about how can we quickly make sense of what's going on in an organization. What I like, what I think when trying to make sense of an organization before we even get to the cybernetics, perhaps what we want to do is just understand the activities that are going on, and we look at the evidence of what's actually happening here, and the evidence of the artifacts in terms of the documents, the labels attached to the different entities and what have you. And then we start talking to people about what's going on, and with it we can then start thinking about the contribution of the Bible systems model in terms of what it allows us to reveal. So it's just a means to discuss what's going on.
Okay, right. Thanks for that. Okay, so going back to one of your slides, so you mentioned about there is an issue with accountability. So what do you think we can do to address this risk? And there's another question that's related to accountability as well. So basically, first of all, is what do you think we can do in order to address the accountability risk, and also about the values? How do we tackle that?
That is a $64 million question, because we start looking at, accountability, in terms of establishing accountability. We see it today with regard to accountability, with regard to COVID and the debates going on there. So, how do we resolve that? And values, again, with the debates that are on about values. I think this is where the value of debate and discussion comes into play, especially when we're using the VIPLAN methodology and the VSM here. It's all about the discourse that's going on here, and establishing accountability, establishing what values we're actually are guiding our behavior. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So we have another question related to VSM. So how can soft system methodology and VSM be layered with VSM working within SSM?
Sorry, can you repeat that question, please?
Right. So how can SSM and VSM be layered with VSM working within SSM? So basically embed VSM in SSM.
That, I know there are academic papers on that. It's not something I paid particular attention to, the VSM being used in conjunction with the soft systems methodology. When I look at it in terms of the learning loop, then I look at it in terms of the activity of modeling, because it may be that we're looking at an organizational solutions, in which case we can use the VSM to explore organizational possibilities. So I'm looking at it from the VIPLAN methodology, not the SSM perspective.
Right. Okay, that's fine. So another thing as well. So Stephen, I'm just curious to know why you are so passionate about cybersystemic.
I like that question, because I was exposed to cybersystemics or cybernetics and the soft systems methodology in the mid-80s by Raleigh Speho, and I worked with it for a number of years in academic roles. And then I suddenly found myself back in the world of practitioners, and with it, I didn't see much relevance in it other than in a couple of change management situations. But it was when I embarked on my doctoral studies looking at online technologies, I suddenly appreciated that there was actually nothing there to handle the complexity of what I was looking at within the Scottish tourism industry. And that led me to write the paper on the Scottish tourism industry through the lens of the Bible systems model. And as I started to get back into understanding, engaging in change and trying to make sense of organizational complexity, I started to get more and more involved in cybersystemics, and then looking at sustainable development. Then we start looking at the complexity associated with that. Then it started to make more and more sense to look to the thinking, the concepts, the approaches underpinned by cybersystemics. When I looked at that, I found that cybersystemics seemed to offer me more than what was available elsewhere. And that's why I started to embrace cybersystemics so passionately, as you say.
So interestingly, you mentioned about sustainable development. Would you be able to give us an example how cybersystemic could be applied in sustainable development?
Well, if you look at the complexity of sustainable development, I was attending a workshop at the Mekong River Basin, and it was a large group of scientists who were looking at the water, energy, food nexus, and they were focusing in upon East and Southeast Asia. And they kept on talking about we need to have holistic approaches with regard to what we're doing. So I very naively asked the question, what is this holistic approach that you're talking about? And no one could actually answer that question. And I presented the VIPLAN methodology as a way of making sense of this. And that was where I started to appreciate that when we started to looking at sustainable development, I was looking at what energy food nexus as a particular aspect of sustainable development. I started to appreciate that, well, here we have a VIPLAN methodology, which allows us to try and unpack all that's going on here. And with it, we can look at it in terms of, well, the Mekong River Basin is a very complex river system, which can be unpacked to reveal it in many levels. And from it, you know, what's the system of focus that you're wanting to address? And it made a lot of sense then. And that led to the paper that I published on the Water Energy Food Nexus.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. So one last question. So what would you be saying to practitioners about applying VIPLAN, for instance? Because obviously when we bring out, as an academic, when we bring out this kind of concept to practitioners, to people in the industry, they may find the concept is a little bit abstract to be implemented in practice. So what would be your advice to practitioners?
I think I would view it as a heuristic. I view it as a guide. I'm not so sure that you're wanting to be using it prescriptively. I think it's a very guide. You find yourself in messy situations. What do I do? And as you progressively unpack or reveal the complexity of the situation, and you start to wonder what it is that you're doing next. What it does, I suggest, is provide pointers with how to engage in whatever stage you are in the inquiry and whatever it is that you're actually doing here. So I would start looking at it. There are two modes to use the software system methodology, the VIPLAN methodology. One mode is to use it in a rigorous prescriptive mode, which I don't advocate, but I suggest let's use it in a rather looser manner as a guide to help us better make sense of complexity and handle situations here. So that's my advice to practitioners.
Right, thank you, Stephen. I particularly like the fact that you are talking about trying to make sense of the complex situation of the organization. So thank you so much for this very insightful presentation and sharing all your expertise and experience with us. So as we are drawing to a close as well, I would like to thank everyone who joined us today. So your presence and your engagement have greatly contributed to the success of this lecture. So just a reminder, so our next lunch lecture will take place on the 23rd of November on community archaeology and the discovery of an ancient Roman palace with Dr. Chris Lockyer. So thank you again for your participation. So if you have further questions or if you would like to share your further thoughts, etc., please feel free to contact Stephen on Cybersystemics. And we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Have a wonderful day.